If Christianity has much historical wisdom to offer, why is it so derided in the academy? Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Why? Brian Ross. Well, I think that people generally think of Christianity as science for stupid people. It's something like that. You know, and it's often reduced to its more fundamentalist manifestations. So, you know, the straw man version of Christianity is fundamentalist Protestantism of the sort that makes the case that the Bible is literally true and that the cosmos is roughly several thousand years old. Well, it's easy to make fun of that. I'm not sure it's so wise to make fun of it. I mean, people generally have reasons for what they believe, and sometimes it's fear and narrow-mindedness and ignorance, but sometimes what might appear to be fear and narrow-mindedness and ignorance is actually the attempt to preserve something of extraordinary value, the value of which has not been fully articulated. I guess partly I see there's the ability for people to generate the straw man version of Christianity and then just feel intelligent by comparing their own knowledge to that. And, you know, that's pretty weak, I would say. I think Marxism contributes to it a lot. I mean, I think that the universities and our intellectual life in general is still saturated with Marxist and neo-Marxist presuppositions. And I really think that's a terrible thing. I really don't think that that's any better than having our intellectual landscape populated by neo-fascist ideas. I don't see from a historical perspective that there's any reason whatsoever to assume that neo-Marxist ideas are any more morally appropriate than neo-fascist ideas. And I think a lot of what drives the neo-Marxist analysis of Christianity is some of its simple-mindedness. I mean, the Marxists tend to reduce everything to power or to economics. And I mean, power and economics are important, but to reduce everything to that is to reduce everything to any one thing is a mark of a weak mind. I mean, most problems are multivariate problems. They're not univariate problems. I think there's a hatred for the responsibility that genuine Christianity lays upon a person. Because at an archetypal level, I mean, if you just speak about this psychologically, Jung said, for example, the soul is naturally Christian. It's a hell of a thing to say. But he had his reasons for saying that. And part of what he was saying was that, or what he believed, and Aldous Huxley talked about this a bit too, is that there are elements of Christianity that have taken conceptualization as far as it can go. And that's what makes it archetypal. So I can give you an example of that. So there's a presupposition in Christianity, speaking psychologically, that human beings make progress by making sacrifices. That's a good one. You see this acted out to begin with, to some degree, in the Old Testament, where the sacrifices that people make are genuine archaic sacrifices. They take something that they believe has value, perhaps a prize animal, and burn it and offer it to God. And the reason that it's burned, as far as I've been able to tell, is because the archaic conception of the world was that the world was a flat disk, and on top of that disk was a bowl, and the bowl was the sky, roughly speaking, and then outside the bowl, that's where the gods existed. And I think archaic people believed that for the same reason that we feel awe when we look up in the night sky. You don't want to make the mistake that just because people didn't know some of the things we know now, that they were stupid. They looked up at the night sky or the day sky and felt awe. And part of the intuition that came along with that awe was that while they were looking at the night sky or the day sky, they're looking into the infinite. And that's allied very tightly with divinity. So there's those ideas going in the background. Well, if you burn something and offer it up to God, the smoke rises and God can detect the quality of your sacrifice. And you might think, well, that's pretty simple-minded, but it's not. It's the dramatic representation of an unbelievably profound idea. And the profound idea is that sometimes, in order to make things go properly, you have to let go of something that you deeply love or deeply want to do. And what it means to sacrifice is to let something go in the present so that the future can be better, or to let something go personally so that other people can have it better. And there's no difference between the idea of sacrifice and the discovery of the future. As soon as you discover the future, one of the things you realize is that you have to sacrifice things in the present so that the future manifests itself in a more acceptable manner. So then you think, well, that's also an amazing discovery. Here's the discovery human beings made. If we change our behavior in the present, better things could happen in the future. Well, no other animal really has ever discovered that. Okay, so that's very tightly linked into the idea of sacrifice. And so you might say, well, you have to sacrifice something of value. And so sometimes I ask my students, a lot of them are children of immigrants, what did your parents sacrifice so that you can go to university? And I mean, everyone understands that question. The students immediately tell me of, the things that their parents have done. They moved from some foreign country. They spent 18 hours a day working their fingers to the bone at a laundromat or a dry cleaner so that their so that their children could have a richer and fuller life. They're sacrificing, and the sacrifice is based on faith, and the faith it's essentially a form of religious faith, but we don't have to get into that at the moment. But the fundamental driving idea is that the reality can be positively shaped by sacrifice. Well, that's an amazing idea. Well, so then you might say, well, okay, the higher quality the sacrifice, the more profound the positive effect on the future. It's a reasonable proposition. And so then you might say, what's the most valuable possible sacrifice? And the answer to that is, well, obviously yourself. So then you could say, well, that means that the ultimate moral injunction is to sacrifice yourself in a manner that makes the future better. Well, that's the central idea of Christianity. The central idea, like the central figure, mythological figure at the core of Christianity is the person who voluntarily sacrifices themselves to the benevolent will of God. Well, if you have any sense, you're terrified of that idea, and especially if you're I would say if you're a rationalistic intellectual or a rationalizing intellectual. I mean, who the hell wants to believe that that's your moral obligation, is to sacrifice yourself for the best? Well, God, you don't know what that means. I mean, the archetypal story is it means that you end up crucified. Well, there's lots of reason to be not very happy about that idea. And then you say, well, is the fact that Christianity is derided in the academy a good thing or a bad thing? Mostly it's a terrible thing. It's not like Christianity can't use some criticism, although I think, Nietzsche, in many ways, Nietzsche took care of that for us. But mostly I think what we're doing in the academy is running as fast as we can from the responsibility of burying our culture and revivifying it. And we were using any number of appalling rationalizations and ideological maneuvers to try to not only make that acceptable personally, but to proselytize about it to others. And the more, I wouldn't say cynical, maybe I would, the more cynical part of me sometimes thinks that the universities now do students more harm than good, especially on the humanities end, because they take students at a very formative period of their life when their belief systems and their ability to identify strongly with life are already somewhat in question because they exist in a culture that's been badly fractured. And they take those kids and they expose them to ideas that are absolutely destructive. And it's not like I have anything against ideas like that. Reading Nietzsche, for example, or reading Dostoevsky, I mean, that can be a very destructive act. But the purpose of Nietzsche's writing and Dostoevsky's writing is not to destroy. It's to remove detritus so that something new can spring forth. And I just don't really see that happening in the universities. I think they're too cynical. And I think that there's also a strong streak of serious anti-humanity among modern intellectuals, and that's been the case for at least 100 years. You hear people say, you know, like, I think this was a statement from the Club of Rome, the people who were so concerned about a population explosion back in the mid-1960s, that the world would be better off if there were fewer people on it, or maybe that there were no people on it. Well, man, you can't say anything that's more appalling than that. You know, if you said the planet would be better off if there were fewer black people on it, it's like, well, no one's going to put up with that. Or the planet would be better off if there were fewer European colonizers on it. Well, you might be able to get away with that a little bit more, but probably not. But as long as your sentiments extend to humanity as a whole, it's perfectly reasonable for you to say something like that. And that's the most horrific thing you can possibly say. I mean, the kids who go into high schools and shoot them up, the Columbine kids, that's certainly what they believed. The planet would be a lot better off if there were fewer people on it. Maybe we'll take a few steps in that direction.